Every drawing teacher in the history of planet Earth who's taught portrait drawing has told their students this: you need to understand the skull really well to draw great portraits. And I think the students are always left with this question: how does knowing stuff about the skull actually help you draw better? In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what anatomical landmarks on the skull line up with the features of the face that we can see on the surface. If you're here, you probably know it already, but I have a Patreon page that's filled to the brim with lessons exactly like this one. If you follow the link in the description of this video, it'll take you to the sign up page, and for $10 you get tons and tons of really great educational content. Anyway, let's get to the lesson. I've arranged here an average expression of the skeletal anatomy of the head so that we can draw and memorize a very average expression of a human head. So let's take a look at where these two different models line up with each other. Focusing first on this anterior view of the skull, let's point out where the median line of the skull falls. What isn't visible in this initial view is actually visible from the lateral view. You can see that the median line of the skull in my block-in template actually has a bit of an arc to it. It's not perfectly flat. This means that if there was light coming from the upper right-hand side of this model, the upper right-hand quadrant of this 3D block-in model would actually be the plane which receives most light. The next major feature I want to discuss is the zygomatic bone. We have this section of several different line segments converging on what is the widest point of the face. Taking a look at that convergence from the anterior view of the skull, you can see that the major angles above and below it are arcing slightly outward from the median line. This is meant to show us several things, namely that in the anterior-most section of the skull, the distance in between these two protrusions of the zygomatic bone represents the widest part of the face. Even the brow ridge and the forehead, which often give the impression of being the widest point, are in fact a little bit more medial than this widest point of the face. Moving up to the forehead, there are several interesting points to discuss. Let's start out with this one here in the center. The relevance of this one, of course, is not really revealed from this anterior view. From the lateral view, however, what we notice is that it is the main or major plane break of the forehead. Eventually, when we're talking about three-dimensional models, it's important to figure out a way to communicate in line how we're going to get from this depth, which is, of course, the front plane of the forehead, all the way back to this point, which is the furthest back visible point of the cranium that we see in this anterior view. So plane breaks are essentially like depth markers, showing where two planes converge and therefore also how two planes differ in their orientation to you. After that, we move to these two convergences here and here. Once again, the lateral view reveals something that is difficult to see from the anterior view. We have on the side plane of the head what is referred to as the temporal line. This landmark continues moving backward on the cranium, across the frontal bone, and onto the parietal bone. What we need to know about it is that it is the major indicator of the plane break in between the front and top plane of the head versus the side plane of the head. Coming back to our anterior view, you can see really clearly how this angle break is represented when viewed from a perspective that really reveals its impact. It probably makes its biggest impact when we're drawing in value because it is the primary reason also why we can represent the 3/4 angle of the head as being full of light and the entire side plane as being in dark halftone and shadow. Knowing about this particular division and how to use it gives you so much control over the expression of value in your portrait drawings and portrait paintings. Now, when you're blocking in, choosing the height at which this major angle break here takes place actually brings us to the next relevant anatomical feature. Though it's not included specifically in the block-in, the frontal eminences here and here mark the superior lateral edges of the middle major plane of the forehead. For the purposes of this block-in, they're going to be a little bit lower than that major plane break of the forehead that I described earlier, and when found should roughly give you the top of that shield-shaped front plane of the face. Moving on, I want to talk about the top edge of the zygomatic arch. This particular feature is going to be important from the first set of lines that you put down on the paper all the way until you're modeling the final forms and the most subtle shadow values that you've chosen. Now, a couple things about the zygomatic arch. I mentioned that the widest point of the face can be found here on the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic arch itself, which is a combined feature of the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone, actually gets wider the further back in depth it goes. You can see on this anterior view that we have one width for the widest part of the face, and that the zygomatic arch itself gets much wider on its way back to where it lands on the cranium at the bottom edge of the temporal bone. Of course, this is relevant from a structural perspective, but how it's relevant to the value expression in a portrait
is that it represents a horizontal division of the two main planes at the side of the face when you're making a portrait drawing. So if we have light coming from above, what we're typically going to find is that the plane above the zygomatic arch is going to be a little bit lighter than that plane which is below the zygomatic arch. Similarly, when we're looking at a lighting situation where there is a secondary light active, meaning that we have one light coming from the upper left-hand side, we have a main shadow edge here, and that both the top and bottom plane, as divided by the zygomatic arch, are in shadow. That reflected light from a secondary source will tend to light more the downward-facing plane, leaving the upward-facing plane a little bit darker in relationship to its neighbor. While we're here, let's talk a little bit more about this particular angle break. It falls just about in line with what is overall the widest point of the entire skull, and that is the parietal eminence. If we had an ear on this skull, the parietal eminences would be able to be found usually above and just behind the ear. Now, with most of our models having hair all over their heads, this is not going to be the most significant feature to know. But let's say your portrait is of someone who has a little bit less hair. Of course, this point, the parietal eminence, can become an important one to know. Now, all the way at the other end of the block end, we find another significant feature. At the apex of this triangle, we find something called the mental protuberance. This feature is responsible, of course, for the upward-facing and then subsequently downward-facing sections of the chin that we find in a living. It also serves to define pretty well this little breaking plane in between the front plane of the face and the bottom plane of the mandible. I've also used its lateral edges here to connect together the widest point of the face and the widest point of the chin. This is a relationship that Vanderpool uses to describe what he calls the major plane of the face, which eventually concludes at the widest point of the chin. Now, what happens at the top of this major plane of the face? We come across another bony feature that's significant. Right here, we have what is called the orbital margin. This is a subcutaneous bony point, and it separates the upward-facing plane of the cheek from the subsequently forward-facing plane below it. In standard portrait lighting, which is that upper three-quarter facing light, the orbital margin generally catches a pretty decent highlight, and so it's pretty easy to find in the living. Now that we've talked about the zygomatic arch, we talked about the lateral edge of the major plane of the face, and of course the mental protuberance. This section of the skull we refer to as the mandible, and it has two main parts. Part 1 is the ramus, and part 2 is the body. So we have then the inferior border of the body of the mandible, and we have the angle of the mandible represented here. The lower third of the face is famous for having a lot of fleshy tissue surrounding it, so few of these bony points are subcutaneous, with the exception of the mental protuberance and a little bit of this jawline. So that's three main borders of this plane sorted out. We have remaining this posterior border here to talk about. Quite naturally, it reflects the angle of the ramus of the mandible, but we also need to know where it ends. This indentation right here is referred to as the external auditory meatus. You may or may not ever have to repeat that in your entire life, but what it's called colloquially is the ear hole. And just like a lot of things in anatomy, it serves as a very useful landmark when trying to describe exactly where we find the zygomatic arch itself. Usually we'll locate the widest point of the face and then the external auditory meatus, and by that we will be able to infer the angle of the zygomatic arch. What about this lowest angle here? What's relevant about these points? This bottom edge is dominated by one major useful feature, and that is the mastoid process. It is slightly visible from the anterior view, but of course it's best seen in this lateral view. And it's primarily important because of what attaches to it. The origin of the sternocleidomastoid, which is the major muscle that we find at the side plane of the neck, comes down and eventually attaches to the top of the sternum and the inner third of the clavicle, starts out on the mastoid process. Therefore, this bony protrusion that's found just below and behind the ear is in itself an incredibly important landmark when we're making a portrait that is more than just a head, that is attaching a head to the shoulder girdle. Moving further to the back of the skull, we find an angle break here that represents another bony landmark that is subcutaneous, that is the external occipital protuberance. So you remember when we were talking about the different sections of the cranium and how some bony landmarks are named for the section of the cranium where they're found. In this case, the occipital bone houses the external occipital protuberance. It's highly unlikely that you're ever going to use it in a portrait drawing or painting, but it's useful enough that you should store it away if you do subsequent anatomical studies, because it is also a very significant place when we're trying to attach the head to the body in a view from behind.
If you find that at the end of this video you want to dive deeper into facial anatomy and how that relates to portrait drawing, you can check out my Anatomy for Portrait Artists course on my Patreon page. Follow the link at the top of the description of this video and it will take you to the sign up page where for just $10 you can get access to that group of lessons and tons of other really great drawing content.